Okay, welcome to our budget hearing. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Patty, I'm going to follow you, Patty.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the
United States of America and to the
republic
for which it
for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty
liberty
and
and justice
for all.
for all.
Pauletto Fries,
Here.
Judy Fouché,
Here.
John Crean,
Here.
Scott Latham,
En route.
Brian Tobin.
Here.
I'm not going to do the emergency exit because you all know your own emergency exits.
We hope. Okay, I'm trying to. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at two different screens here.
Eric, I'm going to test the check-in with.
Okay.
Oh, Scott doesn't have the email. Eric, oh, well, who can?
What do we need to do? Just send him, text him the link?
I don't know how to text him the link though.
Yeah, you could just text him the link.
But I don't
I
know
can
how-
I can go to the email and text it from there.
Paulette, I'll text you the link and you can copy and paste it.
Oh, that's great because, oh, you don't have his cell number?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it asking for me to jump in?
Yep, sorry.
All right, so it works off your phone.
All right.
Yep,
So,
here come-
Nope, that's you.
Okay,
No,
we
it's
got-
Brian's
All
second.
right, I'm going to jump out with the phone.
Okay.
oh, I see Brian, ×2.
Yeah.
Eric, you didn't send it to me yet, right?
No, I'm looking at my email.
I can send it to Scott if you need.
Oh, go ahead then. Can you text it to him?
Yeah, I'll try. I'll do it.
I'm gonna tell him you're texting him the link.
All right.
Well, it's a good thing we don't all live in the same neighborhood. We've lost power.
I did see my lights flicker.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
There he is.
Okay.
All right.
He's sideways, but he's there.
Oh, wow.
Rotate the phone.
He's connecting to the audio, right? Oh, there we go. Hi,
There you
Scott.
Hello.
Oh.
As you can see, I'm in the dark.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right,
Sorry
well,
about that.
That's all right. We did the pledge.
What'd you do?
So at this point, we will turn the meeting over to Mr. Gamberg and Mr. Scheid, I believe.
Okay, there was no other business.
We have a change order and we have to adopt the budget.
After
the-
Paulette?
Well, the agenda says budget presentation. so
Okay,
it's just-
yeah, I'm sorry. We'll start with that. So, yeah, I'm going to just basically turn it over to Mr. Scheid. I will say that even though this is an unusual process, to say the least, that we are working through to present the budget in preparation for adoption. We have been working very hard and we're very mindful of the economic and other challenges that our community is facing. And I think you will all see, those of you who watch this from the public as well as the board right now, that we have taken additional steps to pay close attention to the economic challenges that our taxpayers are going to be facing. And great deal of credit to Mr. Scheid, who's been very creative and worked very hard to get us to this place. So with that, Mr. Scheid.
Okay, let me try and
Yep,
open it up.
we're all adjusting.
Great.
Oh, so I don't need the other screen then. Okay.
So is this working for everybody?
Yes?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you, everybody. It's my pleasure to present the 2020-21 proposed budget. I'm going to jump right in. Right off the bat, we are within the tax cap as far as the tax levy associated with this budget. All the program staffing are remaining intact, including the security guards that we started a year or so ago with both one in each building. Some key areas out there, pleasantly, health insurance was only 2.16% increase roughly. There's different levels, but that's the average increase. Again, years ago it was double digits, so again, that's a very good sign. The retirement system had a decent increase, 7.5% increase, with the rate jumping to 9.53. The good news is it was expected. You know, the retirement system bases it on the stock market and the 5-year average, and we knew there was a year that was falling off. So again, it was what we did in the 1920 budget. We didn't drop the rate to 8.86 where it was higher before. So we kept it in the 9 range. So basically the increase was nominal this year. And again, we just were trying to avoid any kind of spikes up and down. The budget has 120,000 in the transfer to capital line, which we'll discuss, which is a slight decrease from the prior year. So some of the key categories, I'm not going to go too much detail in each one, but you can see that starting at the top, with most school districts, salaries and benefits are typically your 75 to 80% of the budget. And you can see that the changes were roughly to 2.7, 2.5% in those areas. We had a few retirements this year that we took advantage of, typically the lower salaries coming in. And transportation, you can see a $14,000 drop, 1.5% reduction. This was strictly because of, we typically have contingent money, some monies in case some new, I'd say out of district transportation comes up, and where we did is just really just lower that cushion in transportation. Again, because we're very mindful now, these are just crazy times, difficult, you know, for the taxpayers out there. So again, this, in my opinion, this budget is very mindful to try and keep the tax increase as low as possible. BOCES is nominal increase. Debt service, interesting, we try to, because now in this, with this pandemic, the 1920 has a very odd year where we've seen a lot of the same revenues in the budget, but our expenses in many categories are reduced. In a higher than normal surplus. And one of the things I've been working with Munistat, our bond council, is to prepay all the energy performance debt. So there's roughly 10 years left and 128,000 a year. So I think that would be ideal if we do have the funds, and this decision can be done before June 30th, is to pay down as much as we can that energy performance debt. And again, because of that unanticipated surplus this year, and this is just going to save the taxpayers over the, again, say up to the 10 years. Special education, everything with non-salary, you see a drop. And same thing, this is because we're strictly really just lowering tuition. We've had several years of out of district tuition has just been steady and not on the rise. So we're using some of that projected surplus in those areas and just lower the cushion. And the bottom is the main budget. Now we're looking at a proposed $31,010,000, which is a 1.33% increase. Just jumping a couple with the key with the revenues. The main one, the tax levies, which you know, we don't have much state aid. The tax levy is the bulk of the revenue comes from. We try to, again, keep this amount as low as possible. Right now, we're projecting a 1.4% increase for the tax levy. State aid, now this is based on numbers that we received a few weeks ago of the best case as what we had at that point. In other words, we do anticipate there's going to be further cuts with state aid. We don't have those numbers yet. And numbers, again, to repeat, it's based on the data from the governor's proposal from a few weeks ago. You can see because maybe it's increasing. Like I said, we're expecting certain categories, expense-driven, BOCES to come up a little bit, but it's relatively flat. The ROTC aid roughly the same. Shared personnel, there was a drop. As everybody knows, we're not sharing the superintendent next year, so that was the main reason for that drop. And the other tuition lines, again, roughly the same amounts. The tuition is for out-of-district tuition, say with New Suffolk and even maybe for import. The use of fund balance, appropriated fund balance, which has come up typically each year, and rightfully so, because that's the number we're going to give back to taxpayers. But it's tricky. I mean, you don't want that number to be too much. Years ago, it was high, almost $1 million. And that just means you have to build that money in the budget. So we're trying, have been kind of reduce the budget. And again, we're doing it again this year for any cushions. But again, 1% is where we're anticipating the 300,000 to stay at. Again, I think it's very manageable and reasonable. We're increasing the use of reserves. Same theory. The more money in good times, we fund the reserves. Again, now is the time we just need to bump up the use of the reserves again, so this way we don't have to impact taxpayers. And the total revenue should be the same, well, is the same numbers as the expenses. Again, a 31,010,000 budget for a 1.33% increase. And we wanted to make sure we have some planned projects for transfer to capital. This is a good line to have, where each year we're trying to maintain it in the budget because it helps, some older buildings, but there's just certain things, upgrades we want to try and have and get done. And this way, again, there's room in the budget. Let's try and get things done instead of waiting for, say 15 years for a bond issue.
Mr. Scheid, just to be clear, no, Chuck, no decisions have been made on this. This is for a future conversation. There's no rush. There's no hearing that has to take place. Am I correct?
Correct.
Yeah, a lot of flexibility here. It's not a huge number, but it's a sufficient number to get some small things done.
Exactly. We typically use a repair reserve a lot. Again, that saves a lot in the budget. That's just something that helps. That's where you're saying, right, we do have the hearing for that. So these are, again, non-hearing. Again, typically larger projects, something, again, you can't, typically would budget for. Again, I do want to make sure, because the bus is tricky, we really want to make sure the voters know that we're thinking about replacing one of our older buses that we use for a lot of trips. And again, it was just, the bus is at the end of its life. It's no longer going to pass inspection, which every 6 months it's required to go through inspection. So it's just a replacement of one of our fleet.
And can I interrupt for 1 second on that, Chuck? And
Sure.
that would go to the capital line?
Yes,
The bus?
correct. As opposed to what you're thinking, it could have, this was the option as opposed to, say, in a transportation line.
Yeah, that's where I would, I don't understand. I don't think of the bus as being, okay, if that's what it is. I just don't remember ever doing a bus purchase through the capital before, but that's okay.
I think in
Okay.
the past
I
we've
think,
had.
yeah, there's several, you can bond buses, there's other options.
In the past, we've had reserves for to buy the buses.
That too.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the most recent has probably been that. I don't know the last time we did buses, but
A couple of years, not too many years ago, I don't
I
think.
think didn't we have a bus reserve still when we did that?
Yeah.
We may have. I just thought it was a separate line, not in the capital.
I think because it's a it's because of
Capital investment.
depreciation on it, and it's it's. I think that's why it can go in the capital, correct?
Correct.
It's such a, and because of the kind of asset it is.
Yep.
Right. I wanted to put up this calculation. We've been going back to the drawing board the last few weeks to kind of try and cut back as much as we can. So this is the calculation again that we get to. What is our limit for the tax levy cap? So if you look down towards the bottom, our cap for next year is 27,930,000 and change. So we were, I'll say legally allowed to go up a 2.68% increase in our tax levy. With this proposed budget, we're looking of only going up to 27,600,000, a 1.47% increase. And this would mean a 330,000 savings, well, not savings, amount below the tax cap. And, it's again, some careful to look at. One of the downsides is typically we normally would go towards the cap based on other, if everything else is equal. But again, I think in this day and age and this time, it's important to kind of see if we can go as low as it can, because then this is just the base for future years.
Right.
Any questions or?
I do have a question on the revenue side. Obviously, state aid has been and probably will be a moving target. Two questions, actually. Any idea when we will have information on what our state aid is? And the next question is, what contingency plans do we have if the number is significantly lower? And I don't even know what significant would be.
I would say, Chuck, correct me if I'm wrong. Well, it is a moving target, and Chuck can certainly add to this, my commentary. Significant is being talked about in the 20% range.
So
Right.
a significant cut to state aid or cut
Yes.
to the increase?
Cut to
reduction.
state aid.
Cut to state aid.
Well, I mean, we're flat essentially. So it's,
So
they
20%
haven't
cut
determined
would
that.
be what? 1.8 billion, what's 20% of that?
Right, well, that's total state aid. Most of the 20% they're looking at, I would think, is foundation aid. So that's potentially $1 million. So 20% of $1 million.
Whoops, sorry.
20% of the 1920 number is 371,000.
All right, but you're saying
No,
that
no, it's not that number though.
it would be a foundation. So you're talking potentially $200,000, Chuck, correct? If it was a 20% reduction.
Correct.
Okay, so what would our contingency be to make up for that shortfall in revenue?
Well, luckily, Southold is we're in very good shape financially.
Okay,
So there's just various options of, using other reserves, even using fund balance, that we have the means to be able to handle that. As I mentioned a little bit with the cushion that we have for transfer, we have a couple of areas that are tough to budget for is the out-of-district tuition. Again, because those enrollment can change, in a moment's notice. That kind of goes hand in hand with transportation. And we have main areas. So basically, if things go well or fairly status quo for next year, we still have savings in those lines to be able to absorb the 200,000.
okay.
Chuck, if it's a middle of the, I'm sorry, Judy. I was going to say, if it's a middle of the year cut, we can use fund balance, or we can make the decision to, versus making cuts in programs, correct?
Right. Okay.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's one of those shortfall, whether it's mid-year in the state aid. Like I said, you always trying to look at the, what are your expenses at that point? Because then, right, they're definitely enforce, stricter spending, cut back in certain things, and just do a lot more fund balance projections that are more towards the end of the year. So there's other avenues we can definitely put in line. And again, generally speaking, I would say we're very tight with the money. That's just with every dollar. Again, pay money. We have very good systems that have been in place for years and years, and we're continuing to follow it. So, we spend the money wisely. So if we need to cut back, again, I don't anticipate the state aid. I've discussed this with other districts. It seems like a lot of, since the information is not out and not many districts are changing and reducing it, it was an option to kind of do it now. But again, I think we're in good enough financial shape where we can definitely handle it and work out other methods to make sure we end the year well.
All right, thank you. Those were my questions.
Okay, I mean, I did have a couple more slides. I don't know if I meant to.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I seem to have lost your presentation mode. I don't know why. When I got that phone call, I apologize. Not that it matters.
Can everybody else see it still?
I can.
Yes.
And I have
I've got it.
Eric, do you know what I might have done?
No, do you want to try leaving and then rejoin? I'll let you back in.
Yeah, where's the lead? Like all I have is this little sidebar. I've really lost most of my image here. I don't know. Oh, now I see just that. That's interesting.
You see the
Close-
sample school
close that
tax
out of
bill,
Zoom.
David?
Everything is like thumbnail for me. I'm sorry. It's just weird. It's like I lost the whole big presentation. Just keep going. Don't worry. Keep going.
Sure. Okay, so again, the proposed tax billing, these typically the same assessment values that I've used in the past. That the average we use is the 6,500, and so with taxes with this increase, we're looking at the $85 annually for the average house in Southold. Just a couple of factors as mentioned. Again, we mentioned there is savings in a lot of areas that just the services are just not being done this year, of course, and we're going to look at every source of funding towards the bottom, the CARES Act, and to make sure that we're applying for all the monies that we're due. We're going to look at FEMA. Again, it's just a very strange year, but and I hope Mr. Gamber can confirm any need of teachers or anybody else to do the online learning, teaching we've implemented. But again, a couple of ideas. We're possibly thinking about prepaying some expenses this year against the budget and not spending the money next year. Funding reserves at a higher level that we normally would. And again, this would allow us, I'll set up a plan where we're going to use that money over a couple of years, again, to keep things flat. And again, so now, again, we're not worried about this year. I'm worried about the year next year and forward.
Right.
The energy performance contract, again, it's just a huge savings, 128,000 on that, roughly $1 million in principal. Like I said, it's just unknown, unforeseen, the savings this year. We're just, again, it's just kind of a nice way to be able to pay that off early and save the taxpayers having to pay for that debt in the future. So now the budget is for June 9th. As all of you know, it's the mail-in ballots. And I know when I made my notes that we're going to try and make sure we get the information out to the voters, put it on the website, what the protocol all is on returning the ballots, to return the envelopes. Like I said, it's just the crazy times again. So that we'll just make sure, again, we'll just try and make sure the word is out, social media and so on.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that's all I have. Any questions?
I have just a quick question in the slide, the other factors. Prepaid 2021 expenditures in 1920. That is, can you give us some idea on what kind of things you're thinking about paying this year? I know did that in the past too when we did our renovation. We had excess funding, so we purchased certain things because we knew we wouldn't have the money the following year. What kinds of things are you talking about prepaying this year?
Right, it's a good question because it's on one hand, we've been looking at certain things as easy as supplies, textbooks. We're going to look at our equipment line to see what equipment budgets we have this year and just pay certain things, leave it up to the administrators to say, okay, what can you buy this year ahead of time? The tricky part, it is difficult to kind of track to make sure, okay, well, if they save $5,000 in supplies and textbooks, will they spend that same $5,000 next year? So again, we'll have to work out certain details, maybe try and limit the amount of vendors, try and keep it simple, use contract vendors, WB Mason. But it's mainly equipment, textbooks, supplies, and we'll talk to Mr. Dragone about facilities if there's any work that was in next year's budget to do this year. And a lot of times what we do is we do projects that similar to in the repair reserves, projects that just have come up recently to fix. We have a couple of small roof repairs, that are going on. So
You didn't just say roof, did you?
The never-ending project.
Right.
Remind me of the rule with the equipment line, though. You can't add to it, or you can't change it, or there's something with the equipment line in a budget, if I recall.
Exactly, unless emergency purposes. which is to sidetrack a little bit, because I know with Chromebooks, we're in very good shape. You were allowed to increase that equipment line for emergencies for Chromebooks, but again, we're in good shape with that. So you're not allowed to put money into equipment.
Right. Take out, just can't put in.
Well, is there any, or I know we don't know, I know there's a big unknown. Is there anything we anticipate that we're going to need for the fall based on the new way education is going to unfold that we could take care of with this 1920 budget?
Let me take that for a second, Chuck. So
I know it wasn't very clear, but I think you know what I mean.
no, we absolutely. And the starting point of your question, which is a lot of it is unknown. Mr. Scheid did bring up that we are very well positioned, and I do want to make a plug for Mr. Case. He didn't realize how fortuitous it was to really move in a direction to the one-to-one Chromebook fleet, you might call it, that we have, that we replenish regularly, not knowing that we would have to make use of them on such a large scale. Some districts had a scramble to purchase computers all of a sudden, not having thought that they would be moving in that direction so quickly. The other area that we might be looking at, which is unknown as of now, whether it's the PPE, the personal protective equipment that the nurse's office and others, and whether or not masks are going to be required or not by staff, by students, cleaning protocols, we've had some conversation about that, cleaning supplies and equipment, beefing that up. I mean, I've heard districts talk about numbers in the tens of thousands that they are anticipating spending. I would like to think that before June is done, that we will have some clarity on some of those areas besides the academic, educational supplies and equipment things that, you know, we can add to it. We don't have as great a need as some other districts, I might say. If that makes sense.
Right, I don't see a downside in stocking up on cleaning protocol items, because regardless of what happens in the fall, that's a necessary item that will be used, I would think.
Great.
Because potentially whatever that number that is that we prepay, again, potentially if there is a state aid drop, again, that just means.
I know, yeah.
And I was just looking also, I mean, the update with the grants has been great as far as changing what's allowable, what you can charge to grants. Even the timetable, typically it's roughly you grant or you lose it. Now they're allowing a carryover for next year. Look closely at that to see maybe we don't need to maximize the grants in 1920.
Right.
Allow more money for the grants for next year. And most of our grants, they fund salaries, but definitely other things like travel and so forth. So that's, again, another avenue that we're going to look at to see if there's something we can to look at again, just to help the future and look at the current.
Yeah, to suffice it to say, there's a lot of moving parts with all of this. That flexibility that Mr. Scheid just mentioned with grants is very good. So to the degree that we haven't been executing the grants, we've been doing some professional development from afar, but we've also cut back on some of these, what we were expecting to spend in the spring. So there's no rush to spend it if we can carry the full amount over and then just use it to a greater degree next year when we need to use it, potentially. So that's a positive.
The one which I didn't go into detail or mention is potentially is the vote for the new capital reserve that, you know, as you know, that the current capital reserve has reached its life of funding it. What we're proposing to the voters is that use of the reserve. It's just another great mechanism where you can build up years of this savings in order to alleviate taxing the taxpayers when to go out for a bond. Like we used the $2 million offset the bond project a couple of years ago. That's something maybe I'll put a slide on the website to discuss. 10 years, 950,000 up to 950,000.
Right.
Again, it's like a great mechanism that's helped us in the past.
Yeah, we probably can't say that enough. I think we have to really make that point very clear that the $2 million was one area, and just overall, over the lifespan of that bond that's now finished, that capital reserve, we did fund very judiciously and wisely. Both that and the repair have served the Southold community very well. We want to make that very clear to people.
Agreed.
Yep. Anything else, Mr. Scheid?
Good, that's all I have.
Okay. Mrs. O'Frias, I'll turn it back over to you, if that's okay.
So the planned expenditure for the 2021 school budget is $31,010,000?
Correct.
Correct.
I just wanted to get the number right on my piece of paper here. Okay. And are there any other questions on the
Everybody.
budget presentation, guys? So I need a motion to adopt the budget recommended by the superintendent for the 2021 school year. The planned expenditure is $31,010,000.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
No,
Aye. Opposed? I don't know if Scott's there or not.
He is. I see him.
I see his
I
eye.
see his eyes.
Oh, no.
The reflection in his glasses.
Dark, poor
Wow.
guy.
Could you hear how you both?
That's pretty wild.
That's kind of spooky, Scott.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Scott?
I don't know.
Aye.
Hi.
Okay.
I'm gonna have nightmares now.
We have one other action.
I'm here.
Oh, even better.
Just don't do that.
Eric, is this how the recording is going to come out?
Did you ever think
yeah.
having a
I think it's Kenny.
It's pretty
Okay,
wild.
I need a motion to approve the following change order number 1, DNS Mechanical Services.
Okay, so moved.
The total additional cost is $21,730. This has to do with the bond project, right, David?
Yes, that's correct.
And we have the lines and what it all did. I think it was just to make that check room a better place.
Correct.
Correct. Who seconded that motion, if anybody?
Second.
Brian,
Okay.
all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, I guess we need a motion to adjourn. Thank you very much for all your work on the budget, guys. It's low.
It's low.
It's lower than we had to be, and I, for one, really appreciate it. Thank you.
I do too. So thanks. And all the work you're going to continue to do over the next month and a half to figure this out. I don't envy your job, Chuck.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Please keep us posted, yes.
Thank you for staying on all of these, all these little trails you have to follow. It'll be interesting to hear where they all end up.
Mhm.
Keep us posted. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second was John, Patty. All in
Okay.
favor?
Aye.
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 Scott, are you in favor? All right, motion adjourned.
Aye. Good night.
Good night, guys.
everybody.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.